They say every town hides its secrets. Some are small, harmless things, like a broken oath, a love affair whispered about behind lace curtains, or a debt never repaid. But then there are those secrets so dark, so twisted, that the earth itself seems to shudder in protest. The kind that generations try to bury, rewriting records, burning papers, and urging children never to speak of them again. In one forgotten corner of Appalachia, the secret that lay hidden was not just scandalous, it was unholy. It began with a discovery that shook even the bravest men of that era. Bones, not of animals, but of humans, found buried under the kitchen floor. Imagine the scene. Rough wooden planks pulled up in a dimly lit cabin, the smell of damp earth rising into the air. At first, those gathered thought perhaps it was some unfortunate wanderer, a traveler lost to the wilderness. But as the digging continued, they realized this was no accident, no passing stranger laid to rest. These bones belonged to someone who had lived in that house, someone connected to the name etched on gravestones behind the property. Gravestones that carried a cruel, impossible truth. The names of a mother and a wife were the same. The town doctor, hardened by years of treating bloody accidents and childbirth gone wrong, refused to step foot back into that home after what he saw. The preacher, a man who claimed God gave him the courage to face sin in all its forms, left town entirely once he read the inscriptions carved into the stone markers. He never gave a sermon there again. To him, what had been done on that ridge wasn't just immoral. It was something against the natural order itself, a union that defied God, family, and flesh. And so, whispers began to spread, not in the open streets, but in hushed tones over candlelight, that on that lonely ridge a line had been crossed. A mother had become a wife, and a son had become both husband and child. But to understand how such a nightmare could take root, we have to go back further, to the birth of Jacob Elbridge in the winter of 1869. He came into the world in the most desolate way imaginable. His father was absent, listed simply as unknown on the sparse record that survived. His mother, Sarah Elbridge, was 31 at the time, an age when many women of that era were already surrounded by children tugging at their skirts. But Sarah was different. She lived alone, high up in the Blue Ridge, shunned by the nearby townsfolk who whispered about her behind their hands. They called her that strange girl with the dollhouse voice. Her presence unsettled people, not because she was loud or brash, but because of the opposite. Her words were soft, childlike, too sweet, and her eyes lingered just a little too long on those she passed. She rarely came down from the ridge, and when she did, she always purchased double rations, food, cloth, medicine. One share for herself, and the other, people assumed, for the child nobody had ever seen. Children in town made up stories about her, saying she carried dolls instead of children, that she sang lullabies to the trees. But those who watched more closely began to suspect something darker. Neighbors swore they heard chanting carried on the night winds, eerie tones rising from the hills. Sometimes there was laughter, sometimes crying, but the most unsettling thing was how those sounds overlapped. Two voices, one male, one female, but at the exact same pitch, weaving into each other as if one person were teaching another to copy them perfectly. What they didn't realize then was that Jacob wasn't being raised as a boy at all. He wasn't being taught to grow into his own person, to stand separate from his mother. He was being molded into something else, an extension of Sarah herself. By the time Jacob grew into his teenage years, the transformation was undeniable. At 15, he was already 6 feet tall, pale as bone, with a presence that made others uneasy. And yet he was invisible to the town. He never came down from the ridge. He never shook another boy's hand at a harvest festival or courted a girl at a barn dance. He was a shadow, and Sarah was the only one who spoke for him. But she did something then that would confirm the whispers, something that revealed the unnatural bond she was forging. She appeared in town carrying a small handmade ring. It wasn't bought from a jeweler or blessed by a preacher. No, this ring was carved from the very wood of the ridge where they lived, as though the mountain itself were meant to witness the vow it symbolized. The inscription carved into its band remains preserved to this day in a local museum, and it tells us everything about Sarah's mind, her obsession, and her perversion of love. Asterisk to my life from your birth. Asterisk. Those words stop the heart cold when you think about them. They are not the words of a mother cherishing her child. They are not a blessing for a son's future. No, they are the vow of a wife to her husband. A declaration that blurred every boundary, twisted every sacred bond between blood, body, and spirit. That ring was not a gift of nurturing. It was a binding chain, an oath of possession. Imagine the moment she slid that wooden ring onto Jacob's hand. He was still a young man, not fully formed, not fully free. Yet in her eyes, he was already more than a son. He was her partner, her equal, her reflection. Perhaps Jacob didn't resist. How could he? From his first breath, she had taught him no difference between motherly love and conjugal devotion. He wasn't raised to choose his path. He was raised to orbit hers, to belong to her and only her. The people of that town would never fully know the weight of that ring, but they felt its shadow. They noticed how Sarah stopped calling him her boy and began to refer to him in strange ways, as my beloved, as though she were introducing not her child but her spouse. And the more this strange relationship grew, the more the land around them seemed to recoil. Families nearby sold their homes and fled, abandoning livestock, tools, even family Bibles. No one wanted to live near what they sensed was festering up on that ridge. Something unholy was taking root, and everyone who could escape did. And yet, Sarah and Jacob remained, bound by blood and bound by a ring that never should have existed. A mother had given her son not just life, but her claim to his life, twisting love into a cage and rewriting the very meaning of family. And that was only the beginning of the horror. They called it a house, but in truth, it was nothing like any dwelling the townsfolk had ever seen. Most cabins in those hills were humble, one-room structures with creaking floorboards and smoke-stained rafters. But the Elbridge place, it grew like something alive, something unnatural. It began around 1890, when surveyors first noticed that Sarah and Jacob's land was expanding. Family after family sold their property for far less than it was worth, abandoning their homes in haste, leaving tools in fields and meals still cooling on tables. No one lingered to explain why. They only packed what they could carry and fled, whispering about threats or curses, as though the earth itself urged them to leave. And on that land, Jacob and Sarah began building what came to be known, mockingly, fearfully, as the house with no rooms. It was not a home in the sense that others understood. It was a labyrinth, 7 structures stitched together by narrow, winding corridors that twisted like veins beneath the skin of the mountain. Inside, mirrors were nailed in strange, jarring places, some facing corners, others reflecting endless dark hallways. Windows were boarded up from the inside, blocking out sunlight, while the walls leaned unnaturally, as though trying to collapse inward. Those few who dared walk near the property swore the trees themselves grew wrong there. They didn't stretch skyward like the pines on neighboring ridges. Instead, they bent, leaning inward, as if the forest itself strained to peer at the thing festering at its heart. Mailmen refused to deliver beyond the gates. Hunters circled wide to avoid the property. And locals, those who couldn't bring themselves to leave, began calling it the womb. A cruel nickname at first, but one that stuck, because the longer people thought about it, the more it made sense. A womb shelters life. A womb grows something hidden in the dark. And the Elbridge house, with its suffocating corridors and mirrored chambers, seemed less like a home and more like a place of gestation, something waiting to be born. Jacob himself became a phantom in those days. People saw him only at the edges of town, walking barefoot no matter the season, his black coat trailing in the dirt. Children swore he smelled of perfume, her perfume. He never spoke, but his eyes lingered too long, following those who crossed his path until they shuddered and turned away. He did not blink. He did not smile. He was like a shadow cast into flesh. And at night, from the hills, the voices began again. Farmers woke to the sound of chanting drifting on the wind, rhythmic, unsettling, like a litany spoken in a tongue they could not understand. Sometimes there was laughter, high and shrill, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Other times, there was weeping, but always, there were two voices, one male, one female, perfectly overlapped, as though echoing each other, or perhaps merging. Some swore it wasn't just mimicry. It was more than that. It was one voice split into two, like a single soul trying to speak in harmony with itself. The stories spread. Children dared each other to climb partway up the ridge and listen. One boy came running back, pale as death, swearing he had heard not two voices, but one, his own, calling his name from the darkness. Parents forbade their children from wandering too far, warning them that the Elbridge land was not just cursed, but hungry. By the fall of that same year, something changed. Sarah, who had always been the one to appear in town with her strange voice and piercing eyes, stopped coming altogether. Weeks passed, then months. No one saw her again. And yet, Jacob was not alone. He began to speak of someone. Constantly, obsessively. He referred to my beloved, in casual conversations, in letters, and most chillingly, in the journal later discovered in the ashes of the house. But here lies the horror. The way he described this beloved blurred every boundary of sense. Sometimes he wrote of her as though she were alive, laughing and speaking with him in their labyrinth. Other times he spoke of her as though she were dead, preserved only in spirit, haunting the corridors. To him, she was wife and mother, god and ghost, flesh and specter. One entry in particular, found scrawled in uneven handwriting, sends chills through scholars even today. Asterisk, she is before me and within me. Her touch makes me pure. Her name is my name. Asterisk. And at the bottom, it was not signed Jacob, as one might expect, but simply Elbridge, not a man, not a woman, just the bloodline. It was as if Jacob no longer existed as an individual. He was no longer her son, no longer a person with a separate identity. He was the continuation of her, the vessel of her will. And whether Sarah had truly vanished, or whether her presence lingered in the walls of that twisted house, no one could say. But the town knew, in their bones, that something lived up there still, something that should never have been. It was the winter of 1892 when the town received a letter. Its envelope was sealed with wax pressed by what looked disturbingly like a human tooth, the ink inside a rusty shade of brown. It requested the presence of a physician, Dr. Walter Griggs. Now, Dr. Griggs was not a man of superstition. He was educated, practical, a believer in science. He had heard the whispers about the Elbridge family for years, but to him they were nothing more than gossip from frightened villagers. Until that letter arrived. Against his better judgment, curiosity tugged him up the winding path to the Elbridge homestead. The house loomed like a wound on the landscape. Corridors crooked at unnatural angles, windows nailed shut, and trees bent inward as though nature itself recoiled from what festered inside. Griggs hesitated on the porch, but when the door creaked open, a smell of resin, decay, and perfume drifted out. He stepped inside. What he saw that night was so disturbing he never spoke of it publicly again, and the fragments of notes he left behind, later found locked in his desk after his death, still make the blood run cold. The first thing he noticed were the dolls, dozens of them, lined on shelves and dangling from strings in the rafters. They weren't crafted from cloth or porcelain, as children's toys were. No, these dolls were made of animal bones and dried husks of corn, brittle figures with hollow eyes. But what unnerved Griggs most was their faces. Each one, carefully carved, bore the same likeness, Sarah's face. Deeper in the house, the physician found portraits hung in narrow, suffocating corridors. Each depicted only two figures, a woman and a boy, aging across time. In the first, Sarah appeared young, her hand resting over the crib of an infant. In the next, she was middle-aged, the boy now grown, their faces disturbingly similar. And in the final portrait, they were together as husband and wife, standing hand in hand, with identical eyes and mouths sewn shut with black thread. But the true horror lay beneath the house. A root cellar, crudely expanded into tunnels, led him to what could only be described as a chapel. The air was damp, stinking of earth and resin. And there, on a crude bed, lay Sarah. Or rather, what remained of her. She had been dead for over a year. Yet her body had not been buried. It had been preserved. Her flesh was hardened with resin, her hands folded delicately over a bouquet long since withered to dust. A lace veil still covered her hair. Above her, painted in what Griggs believed was dried blood, were the words, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." The doctor fled that night, shaken beyond reason. In his notes, he wrote only a single haunting line. "I have seen a union not blessed by God nor man." But the town would not learn the truth. For while Sarah's body lay entombed beneath the house, Jacob continued to live above, speaking of her as if she were still alive. To him, she was not gone. She was his mother and his wife, his blood and his beloved. He wore her perfume, braided her hair into cords he draped around his neck, and wrote in his journal as if she whispered back to him from the dark. In his mind, she was eternal. Death had not severed their bond, it had sanctified it. And so he lived, year after year, in that twisted womb of a house. But in 1898, something changed. No one knows how the fire began. Some say Jacob himself set it, either in shame or in an attempt to release the curse that bound them. Others whisper it was the townsfolk, determined to erase the abomination once and for all. But the flames spread too fast for the damp Appalachian soil, devouring the house until it collapsed into itself, a smoldering grave. When the ruins cooled, the coroner and a handful of locals braved the wreckage. What they found defied all reason. The first body was Jacob's. His spine was twisted grotesquely, his arms crossed over his chest as if in ritual. His teeth, once human, had been filed into sharp points. Around his neck hung a cord of rotting hair, Sarah's hair. The second was Sarah herself, still lying on the chapel bed below, preserved by resin even as flames licked the timbers around her. Her eyes had been covered with white stones. In one hand she clutched a Bible, in the other, a lock of Jacob's hair. But it was the third body that silenced even the bravest men. Smaller, charred, malformed, yet unmistakably human. At first, they thought it was a child, but its features told a darker story. Its face was disfigured, its fingers 6 on each hand, and its jaw was nearly identical to Jacob's. Not just genetically, but structurally. The same crooked tooth, the same fracture from childhood healed improperly. It was as though Jacob had fathered a child with his own mother. The implication was horrifying. Jacob and Sarah's union had not only defied the natural order, it had produced life. A child born of mother and son, whose short, deformed existence ended in fire. Some say the flames were mercy, that the fire was the only thing powerful enough to end the nightmare. Others say it was no accident, that Jacob himself lit the match, believing fire could purify what flesh had corrupted. Still others insist it was the town, eager to erase the Elbridge name and bury the shame once and for all. But if they hoped the flames had burned away the horror, they were wrong. For evil, once sewn into blood and bone, is not so easily destroyed. The Elbridge house was gone, but its legacy had only just begun. After the fire of 1898, many believed the Elbridge horror had finally ended. The house that locals mocked as the womb was reduced to ashes, its twisted corridors and secret chapel buried beneath charred beams. Jacob was dead, Sarah's body was found at last, and the deformed child, if such a thing could be called a child, was little more than a blackened husk. People wanted to breathe again, to believe that fire had cleansed the ridge of its curse. But gossip spreads like wildfire, and whispers cannot be burned away. The discovery of that third body, the malformed creature with Jacob's same jaw, his same crooked tooth, his same bone fractures, was a truth too dreadful to contain. The implication was clear. Jacob had fathered a child with his own mother. And if one child had been born, who was to say there weren't more? Who was to say the bloodline had ended it all? For months, the town lived in fear. Mothers clutched their children closer at night. Men kept rifles by their bedsides. No one dared climb the ridge where the house once stood, and hunters gave it a wide berth. It became known simply as the burned place, a scar on the land where birds refused to fly and trees grew twisted and wrong. Then, in the spring of the following year, the records show something that should not have been possible. A name appeared in the church registry, written in careful script, E. Jacobson, age 7, orphan, adopted. No one knew where the boy had come from. No family claimed him. No wagon had carried him into town. He seemed to appear as though conjured from smoke, and the townsfolk, desperate to turn their faces from the past, asked no questions. It was easier to accept him as another orphan left behind by hard times than to consider the alternative, that he was the living continuation of Jacob and Sarah's blasphemous union. The boy was taken in by Reverend Clean, a man whose life had been marked by sorrow. His wife had died giving birth, and his only son had drowned years before. Perhaps he saw in the orphan a second chance, a chance to rebuild what grief had taken from him. He brought the boy into his home, gave him food, shelter, and the kind of care that should have comforted a lost child. But what followed was not the redemption he hoped for. It was the beginning of something far darker. From the very start, E. Jacobson was not like other children. He refused to sleep indoors, no matter how Reverend Clean pleaded. Instead, he built a crude shelter behind the church, weaving branches, roots, and discarded cloth together into something that resembled a nest. When the Reverend asked why, the boy gave an answer that chilled him to his marrow. The walls crushed the voices. "What voices?" the Reverend asked. The child tilted his head, eyes too knowing for his years. "The ones that sing her name," he whispered. The Reverend pressed no further. He told himself it was the imagination of a grieving boy. But in his private journal, he began recording things, small at first, then increasingly disturbing. The boy carved a wooden ring, identical to the one Sarah had once given Jacob, and wore it constantly. He drew strange symbols in the dirt, spirals and circles that never broke. At night, he sleepwalked, chanting phrases in a language no one could recognize. And then there was his voice. At times, when the Reverend spoke to him, he swore he heard not one child's voice in reply, but two, one high and light, one low and resonant, perfectly overlapped, like two instruments playing the same note. The hair on his arms would rise each time it happened, and the Reverend confessed in his journal that when the boy called him father, it wasn't with the tone of a child seeking guidance. It was something else, a command, as though he were the parent, and Reverend Clean the child. Even more disturbing was the way the boy seemed not to age. Months passed, then a year, yet his face remained unchanged. At times, the Reverend swore he saw him smile like an old man, a cruel knowing curve of the lips that no 7-year-old should possess. He began to wonder if the child was not truly human at all, but something else wearing the mask of youth. One night, during a violent thunderstorm, Reverend Clean awoke to find the boy standing over his bed. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his clothes soaked, as though he had been walking in the storm for hours. In his hand he held a burned scrap of paper, the ink smeared and nearly gone. But one phrase was still legible, written in that same rusty brown ink that had summoned Dr. Griggs years earlier. "The bride returns when the sun is ready." That night was the last time the Reverend saw him in peace. Within days, his home would be reduced to ash, his own body discovered in the cellar, positioned in death exactly as Sarah Elbridge had been. Eyes covered, hands folded, mouth sewn shut. And the boy would vanish, leaving only one final message scratched into the wall of his outdoor shelter. She came back. Not as before, as fire, and she took me in her arms. The storm that rolled over the mountains that summer was unlike any the townsfolk could remember. The lightning cracked so violently it seemed the sky itself was splitting open, and the thunder shook the earth like the voice of an angry god. Yet even the violence of the storm was nothing compared to the terror that followed. When the smoke cleared 3 days later, Reverend Clean's home was nothing but a charred foundation. The fire had spread so quickly that neighbors barely had time to form a bucket line. And when at last the flames gave way to blackened ruins, what they found inside silenced even the most faithful. In the cellar, lying on scorched stone, was the Reverend's body. His eyes had been covered with white cloth, his hands folded delicately, his lips stitched shut with black thread. It was the exact same posture in which Sarah Elbridge had been found decades earlier in her underground chapel. But if the Reverend's body was there, the boy's was not. Jacobson had vanished without a trace. No footprints, no witnesses, not even bones in the rubble. It was as though the flames had consumed everything of him. Everything but the message he left behind. Behind the church, scratched into the wall of the crude shelter he had built from branches and cloth, were words that froze the blood of every man who read them. She came back, not as before, as fire, and she took me in her arms. To this day, no one knows what became of that child. Some whisper that he was taken back into the embrace of the very mother spirit that had birthed the curse. Others believe he became the fire itself, a walking ember of the Elbridge legacy. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the nightmare had not ended. Decades passed. The townsfolk grew older. Their children inherited the fear of the ridge, and the name Elbridge was carefully scrubbed from memory. Families avoided speaking of it. Court records went missing, and even church archives mysteriously flooded in 1911, wiping away the last official traces of the family's existence. But trauma has a way of seeping through soil, no matter how deep you bury it. And in 1934, it rose again. That year, a man named Lewis Penn arrived in the region. He was no local. He was a government surveyor tasked with documenting land titles as part of a rural electrification project. Penn was meticulous, obsessive even. He believed every stone wall, every boundary marker, every forgotten homestead deserved a place on his maps. When locals warned him to steer clear of the burned place, he laughed. He was a man of reason, not of superstition. To him, ghost stories were nothing more than distractions from hard work. But then he found the well. It was hidden at the top of the ridge, covered with rotting planks and overgrown with moss. At first, Penn assumed it was just another old water source, long abandoned. But when he pried away the boards, what he uncovered was not a well at all. It was a staircase, spiral, carved from stone, leading down into blackness. Penn descended, rope tied at his waist, flashlight in hand, revolver on his hip. His notes, recovered later from his abandoned vehicle, described the descent in obsessive detail. The air grew colder, damper. The walls pressed in. At last, he emerged into a chamber unlike anything he had ever seen. It was circular, its walls lined with mirrors. Not whole mirrors, but cracked, jagged shards placed deliberately to face each other, reflecting endless fractured images into eternity. In the center of the room sat a wooden chair, small, child-sized, as if waiting for an occupant who had never grown. And painted across the walls in a faded, rusty red was the same phrase that had haunted this bloodline for decades. "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Next to the chair, Penn found a ring. He described it in his notes with eerie precision. Carved from wood, identical to the Elbridge rings recorded in the archives. Inside, burned into the grain, was a name, E. Jacobson. That's when the notes began to unravel. His handwriting, once neat and steady, grew frantic. "It knows my name," he scrawled in the margins. "It's watching through the mirrors." Then one final line. "She's here." After that, nothing. Penn's flashlight was later found 5 miles from the ridge, its batteries still intact. His revolver was discovered rusting in a creek, every bullet still in its chamber. But Lewis Penn himself was never seen again. From that day forward, whatever doubt remained in the hearts of the townsfolk withered away. No one dared climb the ridge. No hunter dared set foot near its borders. And to this day, locals swear the land itself refuses to heal. Birds won't fly over it. Dogs whimper and pull their leashes when led too close. And on windless nights, if you stand very still, you can hear it. 2 voices, one male, one female, rising together in song. Not in harmony, not in beauty, but in a chant that seems endless, circling, unbroken. The ridge became known only as the burned place, a scar not just on the land, but on the memory of those who lived nearby. Parents warned their children never to go there, never to say the Elbridge name aloud, and never, ever, to wear a ring carved of wood. Because the people of that town knew something that outsiders could never understand. They knew that some fires don't cleanse. Some fires don't end a curse. Sometimes, fire is only the beginning. By the mid-20th century, the Elbridge story had become little more than a whispered legend. The townsfolk had learned not to speak of it openly. They referred to the ridge only as the burned place, a cursed patch of earth that their children grew up fearing without ever fully knowing why. For decades, silence was their protection. But silence has a way of drawing curious souls, and in 1979, that silence was broken. He was a graduate student from the University of Virginia, a young man with more curiosity than caution. His field of study was folklore, old ghost stories, oral traditions, the tales families passed down over fires and in rocking chairs. He believed that within legends there was truth, echoes of trauma, hints of forgotten history. When he stumbled across the name Jacob Elbridge in a faded church Bible tucked away for preservation, something about it snagged his attention. It was just a single line in an old newspaper clipping. J. Elbridge, presumed dead in the fire, 1898. No kin. It should have been nothing. A footnote in history. But for the student, it was a thread, and once he pulled on it, the whole rotten tapestry began to unravel. He started with archives, scattered records, land deeds, ledgers. Again and again, the name Elbridge surfaced, never written in full, always an initial here, a signature there. But what disturbed him more were the disappearances. Dozens of them, stretching across nearly 80 years, all clustered around the ridge. Farmers who never returned from hunting. Children who wandered too far. Even government workers whose records simply stopped. The student mapped them out. Each dot marked a vanished life, a family left behind, a question that was never answered. And when he stepped back, his breath caught in his chest. The dots formed a pattern. Not a line, not a scatter, but a spiral, tight, unbroken, turning inward toward the center. And at the heart of that spiral was the old Elbridge property, the burned place. The deeper he dug, the darker it became. Old journals surfaced, charred fragments from the ruins of the Elbridge home, preserved scraps from neighbors who had fled. They spoke of chanting, of overlapping voices, of figures seen walking the ridge at dusk. He came across the notes of Dr. Griggs, the physician who had seen Sarah's preserved corpse, and the terrified scrawls of Lewis Penn, the surveyor who vanished underground. Each testimony, each disappearance, was another coil in the spiral. In his own journals, the student began to piece together a theory. To him, this wasn't just a family shame. It wasn't simply incest or madness. It was something eternal, something circular. The line never broke, he wrote in frantic script. The blood runs backward. Again and again he returned to the same grotesque conclusion. She marries what she births, and he births what he marries. It wasn't a family tree at all. It was a loop, a circle that fed itself endlessly, generation after generation, each birth folding back into itself, each marriage sealing the cycle tighter. The Elbridge family was not living in time the way others did. They were circling it, feeding upon it. A womb that never emptied, a bride who never stopped returning. The student's notes grew darker, more frantic. He began sketching what he claimed were visions. Dozens of drawings of a woman in a wedding veil. Sometimes she was young, sometimes old, sometimes faceless. Her eyes were always hollow, her mouth always sewn shut. And beside her stood a boy. In each drawing, the boy grew older, until finally, in the last image, they stood side by side, man and woman, mother and son, holding hands. Their faces were identical. Their mouths were sealed with thread. On each of their fingers was a wooden ring. His professors dismissed his research as hysteria disguised as anthropology. Folklore was meant to illuminate culture, not to frighten it, they told him. His findings would never be published. But by then, it hardly mattered. The student was consumed. In the summer of 1981, he disappeared. He told his roommate he was going hiking near the ridge. One final trip to gather evidence before abandoning his dissertation. He never returned. His body was never recovered. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, but the ridge gave nothing back. All they found was his camera. When the film was developed, there was only one photo left. A blurry, underexposed frame. At first, it seemed to show nothing but trees. But then, in the background, half hidden behind a crooked trunk, a figure could be seen. A woman, draped in white, her veil trailing like smoke. Her face was obscured by shadow, but her outline was unmistakable. The bride. Some dismissed it as a trick of light, a prank staged by the student himself before he vanished. But those who had lived longest near the burned place shook their heads. They did not laugh. They did not doubt. They knew better than to mock what they had spent lifetimes avoiding. To them, the photo was no trick. It was proof that she still walked, waiting, circling, never gone. And so, the silence around the ridge thickened once again. No one spoke her name. No one ventured near. And if a stranger asked about the burned place, the locals only turned their eyes away and muttered the same warning they had for 100 years. Don't wear the ring. Don't follow the voices. And for God's sake, don't call her back. Time has a way of softening most stories. Tragedies become lessons, and sins fade into cautionary tales told to children at bedtime. But the Elbridge story never softened. It did not settle into memory like a stone in a river. It remained jagged, sharp, and festering, carried not by official records but by whispers, by burned journals, and by the guilty silence of a town that tried, again and again, to forget. Generations passed. The ridge grew over with trees, but nothing truly healed. The burned place was avoided, its soil left untouched, its air avoided as if it carried disease. Families moved away, but even those who left carried the story with them. It became a hushed warning at family gatherings. Don't go back there. Don't ask about the Elbridges. Some names are better left buried. And yet, the silence only made the legend stronger. Every time someone vanished in the nearby hills, every time a cabin caught fire without reason, the whispers returned. Hunters swore they saw a pale figure walking at dusk. Travelers claimed to hear two voices singing from beneath the ground. One male, one female, always in the same pitch, echoing as if the land itself was speaking. The Elbridge name was never spoken, but everyone knew. In the late 20th century, folklorists began calling it one of America's buried stories. A legend so shameful that official history scrubbed it clean. Court documents had vanished, death certificates were rewritten, and church records mysteriously destroyed. What survived were fragments. A ring preserved in a museum, charred scraps of a journal, a blurry photograph of a veiled figure in the woods. Enough to keep the questions alive, never enough to give peace. But those who lived longest in the shadow of that ridge knew the truth. They knew the Elbridge curse had never been about one man or one woman. It was never just Jacob, never just Sarah. It was about the bloodline itself, about a cycle that turned backward on itself like a serpent eating its own tail. The student who disappeared in 1981 had written it plainly in his frantic notes. The line never broke. The blood runs backward. She marries what she births, and he births what he marries. It wasn't a family tree. Trees grow upward and outward, reaching for the sun, branching into new life. But the Elbridge bloodline did not branch. It coiled. It circled. It consumed itself. A womb that birthed its own husband. A bride who returned not once, not twice, but endlessly. And so the legend endures, not as history, not as folklore, but as something darker. A reminder of what happens when blood and obsession collapse into one. When family, love, and identity are twisted until they are no longer recognizable. Some say the circle was finally broken in fire. Others whisper it was never broken at all. That somewhere out there, the bloodline still flows quietly, hidden waiting. Perhaps it wears a different name now. Perhaps it walks among us unnoticed. But if you listen closely, too closely, you may hear it still. The sound of two voices perfectly overlapped, singing from beneath the soil. And in the end, that is the legacy of the Elbridges. Not a tree rooted in growth and life, but a circle, unbroken, eternal, buried beneath America itself. A circle that reminds us of a terrible truth. Forgetting is not the same as erasing. Some bloodlines don't fade. They wait. They return. And they keep turning forever.